you very much, Chairman Tiffany, for welcoming me to your subcommittee for this hearing and for including Wyoming in this important discussion. Commissioner Espy, thank you again for your testimony here and helping elevate the needs of Wyoming to the federal level. One issue I have realized as I have been here in DC is that few in DC actually truly understand the scope of the federal estate in the West and what the implication of that burden is. So behind me, I have a map that just shows Carbon County, your county, Mr. Espy, and it shows the various land ownerships, the brown being BLM, green being Forest Service, the interspersed white is private. You've got local government, Department of Energy, et cetera, et cetera. Commissioner, you touched very briefly in your testimony, but can you please repeat how much of your county is controlled by the federal government?
43%, I think of it as federal government.
48% of the surface estate in Wyoming is owned by the federal government, and 65% of our mineral estate is owned by the federal government. And as you can see in this checkerboard pattern, how complicated it can be when you come from a state or a county where you have this variability of ownership, where you go from federal to private to federal to private to federal to private, and the challenges that it can provide. Could you please describe some of those challenges when you have to deal with this kind of a checkerboard pattern within your county?
Yes. Even if an action is occurring on private land, and even if those are fee minerals underneath that private land, if the access to that private land does cross federal land, then that tips NEPA. Even to just drive across the public land, then the full NEPA can come into, and even to the point of, on my private land, the whole Antiquities Act and where you go through, and it brings in tribal consultation on private lands. It opens the whole door up, even though that is surface fee minerals, but because you have to cross federal land, that does open up the whole door onto the private property.
And it might just be a road that you have to use across federal land. You know, it's been interesting to me listening to the discussion today about the various programs that have been put in place to allegedly streamline and make it so that there can be these collaborative projects and these efforts to try to address some of this, the interface between the state and the private lands and the federal lands. But there are 192 million acres in our National Forest Service. And in 2000, a portion of those are wilderness. And in 2001, under President Clinton, one of the very last things that happened in his administration was the adoption of the Roadless Rule. And the Roadless Rule was a designation that denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands in primarily the western United States. So really what it was wilderness by fiat, by executive fiat. It wasn't done through Congress. Congress didn't designate the roadless areas. It was done by President Clinton without the kind of oversight that you would typically see in a NEPA analysis. In fact, the notice of intent was issued in October of 2019, and the final rule and record of decision was issued in January of 2021. In other words, they didn't follow NEPA. They did violate the Wilderness Act because, as you've indicated, it is only through Congress that we can designate wilderness. But the reality is that these 58.5 million acres of roadless acres are in fact managed as wilderness, meaning they aren't part of any of these programs. And so what have we seen over the last 20 years? Catastrophic forest fires, the incredible outbreak of the pine beetle throughout the interior West. In fact, we know from the Forest Service's own documents that in 1997, there was a blowdown in northern Colorado in the Route National Forest, knocked down 13,000 acres of trees in one night because it was a wilderness area and a roadless area. They never were able to go in and treat that area. Guess what that is? That's ground zero for the pine beetle outbreak. So we can talk about these various programs that might allow for treating in particular limited areas, but the reality is that it is the mismanagement of the National Forest Service lands in the western United States that have been absolutely destructive, not only to our federal lands, but to our private lands and our state lands as well. And I yield back.